Somewhere out there in the dark, something just moved. You don't know what it is. You can't see it. All you have is a sound, a shift in the air, and a body that's suddenly completely awake. Now imagine that feeling. No locked doors, no phone flashlight, every single night for your entire life. No streetlights, just darkness, thick enough to swallow your own hand in, front of your face, and a mind that has to fill in every single blank. Read that again. Every single blank. We already know our ancestors huddled by fires and told stories. That part's almost comfortable now. But there's a whole other side of the night we don't talk about. The births that happened in total darkness. The rituals designed specifically to terrify. The dreams that were treated as literal messages from another world, and the very real creature that visited people in their sleep long before anyone had a word for sleep. Paralysis. By the end of this, you'll understand that the night wasn't just something ancient humans survived. It was something they negotiated with every single day in ways stranger than you'd expect. Let's start with something uncomfortable. The fear you feel in total darkness isn't a flaw in your programming. It's the programming working exactly as intended. Your brain, in the pitch black, does something specific and measurable. It takes ambiguous sensory input, a rustle, a shift in air pressure, a sound with no clear source, and it fills in the blank with the worst possible explanation. Not because you're anxious or irrational, but because for the overwhelming majority of human history, the worst possible explanation was frequently the correct one. Without fire, without walls, without any of the boundaries we now take for granted, an early human standing in total darkness was, statistically, in real danger. Large nocturnal predators, lions, hyenas, leopards, saber-toothed cats were most active in exactly those hours. A rustle in the dark wasn't paranoia. It was often an accurate threat assessment running at maximum speed, because the humans who assumed the worst and reacted accordingly were considerably more likely to survive long enough to have version of ancient nightlife. If the night was genuinely this dangerous, this unpredictable, this saturated with real threat, children. So here's the actual question worth asking, the one that usually gets skipped in favor of the cozier campfire and storytelling. What did people actually do about the parts of life that couldn't simply wait until morning? Because bodies don't pause their emergencies for daylight. Babies don't wait to be born until the sun comes up. Illness doesn't schedule itself around visibility. Childbirth, for almost the entirety of human history, happened without electric light, without sterile rooms, without monitors quietly beeping in the background. And crucially, it happened whenever the baby decided to arrive, which meant a significant portion of human births occurred in the dark, illuminated at best by a small fire, a torch, or nothing at all. This wasn't treated as a minor inconvenience. Across an enormous range of documented traditional societies, childbirth at night triggered specific, deliberate responses. Older women experienced in birth and its complications were often woken and gathered specifically because darkness increased the danger, flickering against a cave wall or hut interior. Some cultures developed specific vocal traditions around nighttime birth, low, not despite it. Complications that would be manageable in daylight became genuinely life-threatening when the only light source was firelight. Continuous humming or chanting meant to keep the birthing mother oriented and calm when visual cues were unavailable, and to signal to anyone else nearby, including anything unwelcome moving in the dark, that this specific spot was occupied, attended, and not to be approached. Sound became a substitute for sight. A voice, in the absence of visibility, did the job your eyes couldn't. Among several documented hunter-gatherer societies, including groups studied in the Kalahari and parts of the Amazon, birth attendants developed specialized roles passed down specifically through oral teaching. Women who were never formally trained in any institutional sense, yet carried detailed, accumulated knowledge of exactly what to do when labor stalled, when bleeding became dangerous, when a baby was positioned wrong. All of it applied by feel and sound in conditions with essentially no visibility at all. That knowledge, refined and passed on entirely without written records, represents one of the oldest continuously practiced medical traditions our species has ever developed. Illness followed a similar pattern. Fevers, injuries, and infections were widely understood across multiple ancient cultures to worsen or intensify at night, and this wasn't simply superstition. Body temperature genuinely fluctuates with circadian rhythm, often peaking in the evening, which means a feverish person plausibly did feel and appear sicker after dark. Caretakers responded by staying awake in shifts, a night watch not for external predators this time, but for the internal crisis of a body failing in the dark, when the smallest changes, a shift in breathing. Compare that to a modern hospital room, its machines quietly translating a body's internal state into numbers and beeping alerts. A change in temperature had to be tracked by touch and sound rather than sight, by resting a hand against someone's forehead in the dark. We've automated the vigilance. We haven't eliminated the underlying task, doing exactly the job that an exhausted, attentive relative once did, purely by staying awake, by listening. And childbirth and illness weren't the only things that occasionally forced people out into the dark on purpose. Hunting and foraging at night, though considerably riskier, happened for very specific, practical reasons that daylight simply couldn't provide. Certain prey animals are far easier to locate after dark when their eyes reflect firelight or moonlight back at a hunter, creating a visible glow that gives away a position a daytime hunter would never spot. Some traditional hunting groups deliberately use this, carrying torches specifically to trigger that reflective glow in the eyes of nearby animals, turning the dark from a liability into a genuine tactical advantage. In hot climates, moving during the punishing heat of midday risked exhaustion and dehydration far more than moving carefully through. Certain gathering tasks were also timed specifically around the cooler, calmer nighttime hours. Cooler night air, torch in hand, senses on high alert. The night wasn't simply avoided. In specific, calculated situations, it was chosen deliberately because it offered something daylight didn't. None of this made the night safe. It made it useful, in narrow, carefully managed windows, for people willing to accept a very real trade-off between opportunity and danger. Groups also organized themselves specifically around the demands of the night. Someone had to tend the fire, feeding it steadily through the hours so it never burned down to embers when it was needed most. Someone had to stay alert enough to notice a change in sound, in smell, in the restless movement of a nearby animal that might signal a predator's approach. These weren't formal job titles, but the responsibilities were real, and they rotated deliberately or through simple exhaustion, ensuring that at any given point in the night, at least one set of eyes and ears remained functional while everyone else slept. Here's a common assumption worth examining directly, that ancient nighttime rituals, particularly the ones designed specifically to frighten participants, were simply primitive superstition, fear for fear's sake, with no real function beyond ignorance. Read that again, though, because it doesn't hold up particularly well once you look at what these rituals were actually structured to do. Initiation ceremonies conducted at night, documented across a striking range of unconnected cultures, from parts of sub-Saharan Africa to Aboriginal Australia to various indigenous societies. Young people were often removed from the safety of the group, sometimes blindfolded or disoriented. Across the Americas, deliberately used darkness, isolation, and induced fear as core components, not incidental ones, and made to confront the genuine terror of the unknown, alone, at night, without the usual protections of firelight or community. One especially well-documented example comes from various vision quest traditions among indigenous peoples of North America, where a young person, typically a boy approaching adulthood, would be sent alone into the wilderness for a period of isolation and fasting, often specifically spanning one or more nights without fire, food, or companionship. The goal wasn't punishment. It was a deliberately engineered confrontation with total vulnerability, intended to produce a vision, an insight, or a transformation that simply couldn't happen inside the safety of the group. The night, in this context, wasn't an obstacle to the ritual. It was the ritual's entire engine. This wasn't cruelty without purpose. Anthropologists who study these traditions consistently find the same underlying function across radically different cultures: controlled, survivable exposure to real fear, in a structured setting with a clear beginning and end, guided by elders who know exactly how far to push and when to stop, emerges with concrete, appears to build genuine psychological resilience. The person who survives a deliberately terrifying night embodied evidence that they can face overwhelming fear and come out the other side. That's not a small thing to hand a young person entering adulthood in a world without modern safety nets. There's a second function running alongside the first, and it's just as important. Shared, intense fear, survived together or survived alone and then reintegrated into the group, functions as a powerful bonding mechanism. People who have been through something genuinely frightening together, or who have all individually passed through the same ordeal. The night, deliberately weaponized as controlled terror, became a tool for manufacturing exactly the kind of resilience and cohesion, develop a specific kind of trust and shared identity that casual daytime interaction simply doesn't produce as efficiently. Small, vulnerable group needed to survive. So if you've ever wondered why so many coming-of-age traditions worldwide, independent of contact with one another, gravitate toward the same basic formula: darkness, fear, isolation, followed by relief and acceptance back into the group, it's not coincidence, and it's not primitive ignorance. It's a strikingly consistent piece of applied psychology, arrived at independently, over and over, by cultures with no way of comparing notes. Let's go even further, because the night wasn't only a stage for fear and physical crisis. For nearly every ancient culture on record, it was also considered the primary channel for communication with something beyond ordinary: waking life, dreams. In ancient Mesopotamia, dreams were taken seriously enough to require professional interpretation. Specialized priests, sometimes called baru, maintained detailed manuals cataloging specific dream symbols and their meanings, treating a dream not as random neural noise but as an actual message requiring careful, skilled decoding, the way you might treat an important letter written in a difficult code. Ancient Egypt developed an equally structured relationship with dreams, building specific temples, sometimes referred to as sleep temples, a practice called incubation. Egyptian dream books, some of the oldest documents of their kind ever discovered, where people would deliberately go to sleep in a sacred space, hoping to receive a meaningful dream. List specific dream images alongside their supposed significance, treating the dreaming mind as a genuine source of guidance rather than meaningless mental static. Ancient Greece developed its own version of this same instinct. At healing sanctuaries dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine, sick or troubled visitors would sleep inside the temple grounds, specifically hoping the god would appear to them in a dream, delivering either a cure or clear instructions for one. It's essentially the same underlying idea found in Egypt and Mesopotamia, arrived at independently. Priests on site would then help interpret whatever the dream revealed. In a completely different part of the ancient world, sleep as a deliberate appointment with something wiser than your waking mind. Aboriginal Australian cultures developed perhaps the most expansive framework of all, often referred to in English as the dreaming or dream time, though that translation dramatically understates its complexity. It isn't simply about nighttime dreams in the narrow sense. It's a comprehensive cosmological framework connecting the creation of the reality continues to reveal itself to the living. Night in this framework isn't empty time between days. World, ancestral beings, law, land, and ongoing spiritual reality, with dreaming serving as one of the primary ways that it's a genuine access point to something vast and continuous. And then there's the phenomenon that might be the strangest, most consistent piece of evidence in this entire video: the sensation of waking up unable to move, with an overwhelming feeling that something is in the room, often described as sitting directly on the chest. We now understand this as sleep paralysis, a well-documented neurological event where the brain wakes up before the body's temporary muscle paralysis, a normal part of dream sleep, has fully switched off. Modern sleep researchers estimate that roughly 1 in 5 people will experience at least one episode of sleep paralysis at some point in their life. Some studies place the number considerably higher among certain populations. Read that again. 1 in 5. That's not a rare glitch affecting a handful of unusually anxious sleepers. That's a mainstream, near-universal feature of human neurology, common enough that virtually every culture in recorded history needed its own name and its own explanation for it. But long before anyone had that explanation, cultures with zero contact with one another independently developed strikingly similar descriptions of what was happening. In parts of Newfoundland, it was called the Old Hag. In Japan, Kanashibari. In various Southeast Asian traditions, a specific malevolent presence associated with the exact sensation of pressure on the chest. And it means you harm. That's not coincidence. That's an enormous number of unconnected human brains. Different continents, different languages, different centuries, and yet the same basic experience interpreted the same basic way. Something is here, independently generating the exact same terrifying experience during a specific, identifiable stage of sleep, and independently arriving at strikingly similar explanations for it, without ever comparing notes. Here's the part that might feel a little more familiar than expected. Every single mechanism we've just covered is still quietly running in modern life, just wearing different clothing. Children afraid of the dark aren't being irrational or overly sensitive. They're running the exact same ancient threat assessment system their ancestors needed to survive actual nocturnal predators, except now it's aimed at an empty closet or the shadow cast by a chair. The monster under the bed is a direct descendant of the very real thing that used to move through the bushes 20 feet from the fire. Adults haven't actually outgrown any of this either. The specific, disproportionate dread of waking up at 3 in the morning with your mind spiraling, unable to calm down, convinced something is deeply wrong, runs on the exact same ancient nighttime vigilance system, just without an actual predator or crisis to justify it. The bedtime rituals many adults still rely on, a specific routine, a particular light left on, a sound machine, a locked door checked twice, are modern, quieter versions of the same protective behaviors ancient humans used deliberately every single night to make the unmanageable feel slightly more controlled. Even the specific shape of modern anxiety at night mirrors the old. Pattern closely. Doom scrolling at 1 a.m., unable to put the phone down despite being exhausted, isn't simple bad discipline. It's a very old vigilance circuit, the one that once kept watch for movement in the bushes, now redirected toward a feed that never actually stops moving, checking that the front door is locked for a third. Time before finally settling into bed is a small, modern echo of the ancestor who checked and rechecked, that the fire hadn't gone out, even sleep paralysis hasn't gone anywhere. People today, across every culture on Earth, still occasionally wake up frozen, certain something malevolent is present, describing the exact same chest-crushing sensation as the old hag or Kanashibari, just now more likely to blame it on stress or an alien abduction story or a demon, depending on which cultural framework happens to be available to explain an experience that has apparently never needed an explanation. Huddled and passive, waiting anxiously for the safety of morning. That's not quite accurate. To keep happening. So let's bring this together. We tend to imagine ancient nighttime life as something people simply endured to keep happening. So let's bring this together. We tend to imagine ancient nighttime life as something people simply endured. The night was something ancient humans actively negotiated with, every single day, using every tool available. Sound instead of sight during childbirth, vigilance instead of monitors during illness. Deliberately engineered fear, carefully guided by elders, to build resilience that would last a lifetime. Dreams, treated not as noise but as messages worth the effort of careful interpretation. Even the terrifying weight on the chest in the middle of the night got a name, a story, a framework, rather than being left as unexplained horror. None of this was passive. All of it was active engagement with something genuinely dangerous and genuinely mysterious, using whatever tools a given culture had available at the time. It's worth remembering that all of this, the humming during childbirth, the deliberately engineered terror of initiation, was built by people with no textbooks, no monitors, no scientific vocabulary at all. The careful cataloging of dream symbols, the name given to the weight on someone's chest, just close observation, repeated across generations, patiently turning an incomprehensible, dangerous darkness into something at least partially known. None of these systems required writing, formal training, or centralized authority to function. They spread the same way most durable human knowledge spreads, through repetition, correction, and the simple, brutal feedback of what did and didn't keep people alive. A technique that failed at night usually failed permanently for whoever tried it, which meant the techniques that survived to be taught again were, by definition, the ones that actually worked. It's a strange kind of inheritance to sit with. No artifact you could photograph, nothing more solid than a pattern of behavior repeated so consistently, for so long, that so much of what kept early humans alive after dark left no trace in any museum, that it eventually became instinct, quietly encoded into the people who came after. That sound from the beginning, the one you couldn't identify, the one that made your entire body go alert without. Long enough to have children, still fully installed, still running, still doing its job the only way it knows how. Your permission, it wasn't malfunction, it was inheritance. The exact same system that once kept an ancestor of yours alive. Whether or not there's actually anything out there in the dark tonight. So the next time you feel that specific ancient flicker of unease in a dark room, don't brush it off as irrational. And don't feel embarrassed by it either. You're not imagining a threat that isn't there. You're remembering one that, for most of human history, always was.